I'm Father Cy Hendry. I direct and teach in the Catholic Studies program here at the University of Detroit Mercy. We were concerned because the Supreme Court decision seemed to get in the way of the EPA's approach to trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I ended up partnering. A lot of people, some people called me, and then we got involved in this, but the National Catholic Climate
Coalition.
No, it's National Catholic Climate Covenant and a subgroup in Solidarity. Strangers No Longer, a group, Catholic organizers, advocates, activists here in Detroit, headed by Bill O'Brien, and then the Catholic Studies program. And we wanted to have a conversation to talk about the spiritual, moral, social, and political implications of the Supreme Court decision. We put together a panel, and let me introduce the panel. And I'll introduce them. It's what's funny is they sat in the order in which they're going to talk. Okay. So over here we have Sister Karen Donohue, Sister of Mercy, who's a member of the Sisters of Mercy's Justice Team, who works at a national level on issues of social justice and the Sisters of Mercy's critical concerns. Next to Karen, we have Nicholas Shroeck. Next, the Associate Dean of Experiential Education at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. He's Assistant Professor of Law and runs the Environmental Law Clinic. You already know me. Next to me is Theresa Landrum, a community organizer and activist from Southwest Detroit 48217. She has over 20 years of experience fighting against environmental injustices. And next to Theresa is Matt Mayo, a professor of chemistry, co-chair of the 7-year Journey Task Force of the Office of Mission Integration to implement recommendations from Laudato Si throughout the entire university. I want to start off, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a spirituality that's behind what we're doing. I'm hoping to be brief. In fact, we're all hoping to be fairly brief, so we have time for questions and interactions. I have a couple of experiences of nature that affect the way I look at things. One of those is that I find nature beautiful, awe-inspiring. I can tell you experiences I've had climbing mountains, where I've noticed the beauty of nature in the water around me and the hills and valleys. I'm just going to interrupt this real quickly to welcome Dr. Donald Taylor, who's the new president of our university. Thank you very much. Glad to have you come. Those experiences touch things deep in me and put me in touch with God. I also have experiences of climbing the same mountains and seeing smog all over cities. We have the experience of extreme heat, of wildfires, of floods, of droughts, of intense hurricanes, of threats to health, of shortened lives because of air pollution. We have a very complicated human interaction with our planet. In fact, probably the best way to describe it right now is to say our planet's in crisis. And so Pope Francis in Laudato Si calls for a conversion. He calls for a change of heart, of mind, and behavior, a change of the whole person. And I want to talk about that because I've basically distilled 10 principles of spirituality from what Francis is talking about and from my own experience. First principle, remember God. Right? I talked about having experience of God climbing mountains. It's very easy, though, to take God's gifts and take them for granted. When we lose touch with God, that's what happens. We take things for granted. We tend not to see God present in and through nature. As Catholics, we talk about sacraments. We find God in and through material things. Right? We find God through the stuff nature is made of. Second principle, remember that we're loved by God. If we let that speak to the inner emptiness in our hearts, then we don't have to grasp onto things as possessions to fill that emptiness. We can then appreciate gifts rather than try to own or manipulate them. Third, We ought to understand the Genesis command to have dominion over the earth as caring for and not about manipulating, nurturing rather than owning. Fourth, realize that we're in an organic relationship with the material world. Spirit is not opposed to matter. We're embodied spirits. We're part of the natural world. We're human in a physical world. We relate to God as connected to that physical world. When we forget that, we do violence to our world and to ourselves. Fifth, the gifts of the natural world are given for everybody. Their purpose is to nourish everyone. We're called to share, to love, to care for, not to hoard and use for ourselves, not to neglect. Remember the story of the manna in the desert, that when people held on to it and took more than they needed, it rotted. Right? When we forget that the gifts are given for everybody, then what happens is we do violence to the gifts, to ourselves, and to our world. Sixth, we need to develop a spirituality that's essentially social. We're fooling ourselves only in the context of the human community. We're all in this together. We need to relate to God as members of the human community. And if we don't, again, we do violence to the humanity, to ourselves, and to our relationship with God. Seventh, we need to think in terms of the common good, of what's good for everybody and the good we can pursue in common. Eighth, government is part of this social reality. Government's the mechanism by which we discern and pursue the common good. The Clean Power Plan was actually encouraged by the EPA to discern the best way to pursue limiting greenhouse gases. On June 30th, the Supreme Court got in the way of that. They undermined the social connectiveness and took a very partial view, right, making a decision that was narrow and individualistic, and they missed the basic framework. Ninth, it's time for us to act responsibly. We can't change the situation by ourselves, but we can join with others to do what we can. What we need is a socio-political conversion to work together for the bigger picture. And 10th, don't lose hope. The resurrection defines reality. The resurrection is a statement that not just that Jesus is alive, but that the kingdom of God will come. I've often imagined what it'd be like for Jesus to have risen, gone back to heaven, and the Father says, well, you know, we're glad to have you back, but all that stuff about the kingdom of God is not going to happen. I think Jesus would have said, would you bring me back? You know, I gave my life for that. So I think we need to pay attention to the fact that the kingdom of God will come. Okay, let me leave it there. Let me turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Shai. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to, two things in my time here. I'd like to give you a little overview of how we as Sisters of Mercy have responded to the call to protect our planet. And then just raise some of the questions, at least questions that have come up for me in terms of the West Virginia EPA decision. I claim to be no expert on this, but a few things pop up. It might seem like a big jump from ministering to the needs of poor women and children in Dublin in 1831 to care for Earth as we are today. But actually, we as Sisters of Mercy have been involved in environmental issues for quite a while. Religious communities every so often have a meeting, we call them general chapters, in which we set direction for the next period of time. And back in 1995, at one of those meetings for us, we committed ourselves to act in harmony and interdependence with all creation. So that was, you know, and there was a little bit of pushback, I have to say. Some people said, well, why are we doing this? But so then a few years later, we identified Earth as one of our mercy critical concerns. And we said to reverence Earth and work more effectively toward the sustainability of life and toward universal recognition of the fundamental right to water. So at subsequent meetings, we really reaffirmed this commitment. And then most recently in 2017, we committed ourselves to work zealously towards the sustainability of all life by caring for Earth's ecosystems, addressing global climate change, advocating for the fundamental right to clean water, and committing ourselves to an integral ecological conversion. Of course, this comes from Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si. So just some of the ways in which we've lived out that commitment over the years. The first was by engaging in advocacy. We have taken action around the Keystone pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline, the Paris Climate Accord, some local environmental issues, and support for stronger emission standards for cars and light trucks. We also had a project a couple of years ago around adopting lifestyle changes that we call Mercy Earth Challenge. So over a period of about a year, we had several modules, and they covered areas such as food, the use of plastics, the use of water, purchasing decisions, and then we also have what we called our Mercy Meatless Mondays. So this is a project that, as I said, maybe 2 years ago now, but we're working on updating that. We also, in response to really the call of our sisters in other parts of the world, particularly Latin America and the Philippines, brought to our attention the destructive impact of the extractive industry. So we had a 6-month theological reflection process on extractives. So the groups, we met once a month for 6 months and explored that issue. And right now we're working on how we can maybe repackage that information so that it can be used in other contexts. And then, of course, like many groups like the university and many other religious communities, we've signed on to the Laudato Si plan of action, the 7-year plan that Pope Francis has called us to. So now I'd like to look a little bit at the West Virginia EPA decision. And I say I'm really venturing into the weeds at this point because I don't, it's very complicated and I'm probably missing a lot of the technicalities. But as Sai said, the Supreme Court ruled that the EPA lacked authority under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act to set emissions caps for greenhouse gases based on requiring power plants to transition to fuels that emit less carbon dioxide. So really a very serious issue. So, and I hope other panelists will talk about this, but Chief Justice Roberts applied what they call the major questions doctrine, although there seems to be some question about the major question doctrine. But to put it mildly, so that he said, I'll just read this quickly, he said, a precedent teaches that there are extraordinary cases in which the history and breadth of authority that the agency has asserted and the economic and political significance of that assertion provide reason to hesitate before concluding that Congress meant to confer such authority. So a couple of questions that popped up for me as I read this. First was economic and political significance for whom? You know, that can be, there's a wide variety there. And why not ecological or humanitarian significance? And then in whose interest does our government operate? And finally, can we expect Congress to grant the level of authority needed to address the present climate crisis? And I just want to cite a couple of, these are articles I've read, I'm sure you have too, over the last maybe 6-8 weeks about the climate crisis. I mean, the sirens are blaring, the red lights are flashing, but yet we don't take action. Just in, I think it was in June, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, announced that carbon dioxide levels had reached, I think it was 450 parts per million out in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you know, thousands of miles from the industrial heartland land of the planet. So, and of course, this is like 70 parts per million above that 350 level that we know is considered the upper limit if we're to avoid climate change. The heat waves that are plaguing many parts of the world, our own U.S. Southwest, parts of Europe, India, earlier this year, and I'm sure you've heard too, that heat kills more people than tornadoes, floods, and hurricanes combined. So it's that these incredibly high temperatures are very threatening. Drought, I'm sure you've been reading about the situation out in our Southwest with the Colorado River, that the two big reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are at record low levels. And this system provides water for 40 million people in like 7 states.
Sharon, can I ask you to wrap it up quickly
Okay.
so that everybody else?
Okay, sorry. Okay, so just the failure of Congress to act, the failure to pass the Build Back Better Act, the obscene role that money plays in our political system, and that our lawmakers are more accountable to their donors than to their voters. So, okay,
We'll have time to pick at it.
yeah, sorry.
Okay. Nick, you're up.
Great, thank you. And that's actually a really great introduction to what I was going to talk about, which is a little bit of the history about the West Virginia v. EPA case and how we got there, and really what the state of the law is right now and what I think we can anticipate going forward, sort of near term and long term. And I'll just say at the outset that those of us that track this type of litigation and these types of cases were surprised and dismayed when the Supreme Court agreed to hear this case to begin with. And that is because there really wasn't a live issue in front of the court. That is the Clean Power Plan that's been mentioned. So that's from back in 2016. The Clean Power Plan was never actually implemented. It had been blocked by the court. And then under the Trump administration, there was another plan put forward, which had then been blocked by the courts. And so there really was no actual regulation in front of the Supreme Court for them to opine on. They took it as an opportunity to basically limit EPA's authority in their view under the Clean Air Act. And so I spend a lot of time talking to my students about how the court's always looking to get rid of issues. They don't want to reach the sticky constitutional issues. They love to kick things down on jurisdictional issues or, mootness, that idea that there's not a live issue in front of the court. But here they took this opportunity to look at EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act. And in that regard, many of us were concerned that the court may have gone even further and that they may have limited agencies' ability to interpret statutes passed by Congress in many areas of the law. So not just environmental areas, but issues related to healthcare, issues related to food and drug regulations, issues related to forestry, you name it. They could have really taken a shot at agencies' ability to put the meat on the bones of legislation from Congress, fill gaps where Congress hasn't spoken directly on an issue. And thankfully, in my opinion, the court didn't go that far. It would have completely upended our regulatory system. But this major questions doctrine is something that's very concerning, where the court has sort of set the table in subsequent cases to call into question agency action in areas that the majority of the court doesn't like. Let's be frank, they're using this major questions doctrine to go after administrative action, agency action that they don't like. That's what's really going on here. So depending on, I guess, what your view, maybe you like the major questions doctrine. And really what it means is that if it's something that is very expensive, that is very broadly applicable across our society, the court's saying they want a lot of specificity from Congress, that this is really what they want the agencies to do. Beyond that, they didn't really give much guidance in West Virginia v. EPA as far as where EPA's authority will continue going forward. Okay, so there's a question about why they took the case to begin with. And then this very specific section of the Clean Air Act, 111D, that deals with EPA being able to set the best system of emission reductions across the country. The Clean Power Plan tried to do this by saying we're going to cap the amount of carbon emissions from the electric utility sector across the country. Over time, that would be ratcheted down, looking to phase out coal burning power plants and transitioning to cleaner fuels. The court said that's not what the language of the Clean Air Act specifically says, so they were going to limit EPA's authority to act there. But that's really it. And this is where I would push back over and over again, that like EPA does have authority to regulate the type of fuel that goes into coal-fired power plants. They can require coal from the Western United States, which has lower sulfur content than coal from the Eastern United States. They can require coal plants to be co-fired with natural gas, which limits some of the emissions. They could pass or they could require carbon capture technology to be implemented. Now, whether they're going to do that and whether they feel like they have the authority to do that now, I think there might be a chilling effect from this West Virginia EPA case. But that is to say, it's not, we don't have any opportunity to regulate. It's a question of whether or not our agencies have the courage and they have the support of the public to do that. And then I know we're short on time, so we can talk more about some of the history if you'd like, but I also wanted to say that, you know, moving forward, we really do need a comprehensive climate change bill passed through Congress. You know, EPA is using authority under the Clean Air Act. It's been limited now under this case, but we don't have legislation specifically targeting greenhouse gas emissions, specifically targeting climate change and making investments that we need to move forward. So until we have that, you're going to see attempts, depending on who's in the White House, we're going to see attempts at regulation under existing authority, which in 1970, when the Clean Air Act, when these sections were passed, climate change wasn't the intent, right? It was smog. It was dealing with the visible air pollution, dealing with asthma, health impacts, and all of that. Now we're trying to sort of engineer ways to get at this problem through legislation that isn't specifically on point. So I don't want to leave you thinking that we don't have any legal tools right now to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. We do. It's just that it is limited, and that until we have some, you know, more comprehensive legislation from Congress, you're going to have these fights end up in the courts. And I will also say that if you did have a comprehensive climate bill passed by Congress, I think we would then have a fight over whether or not, you know, Congress has overextended their authority, you know, based on this court. But you have to try it, right? You have to try it and say that this is something that is of critical importance for us moving forward. So that's, you know, kind of basically where we are. I'd say that it's, from an environmental perspective and from a greenhouse gas regulation perspective, certainly a harmful decision. But I was left thinking, well, this could have been worse. And I'm a little bit worried about, there's a case called Sackett that's coming up in this term dealing with wetlands and with regulation of water. That case, I think, is another opportunity for the court to say, we've got these regulatory agencies that are kind of running loose here. We need to rein them in. And so that's, I think, where we're at right now. We really have to be watching this and making really good legal arguments, because the court, again, they've signaled that they're willing to kind of take a shot at these regulations that are meant to protect the environment and public health. So in the short time there, I just wanted to give that kind of context, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go forward.
Thank you, Nick. Theresa?
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I want to switch gears to what this ruling means for communities on the front line. I am from Southwest Detroit, 48217, a zip code that has been deemed the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan, and at one time, #3 in the nation. That being said, why were we declared the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan? Because the community that I come from, which we call the triple cities of Ecorse, River Rouge, and Southwest Detroit, but we see now South End, Dearborn, is home to more than 42 major and minor polluting sources. And in the previous years, we as community have learned that our community has been in non-attainment for sulfur dioxide and other noxious odors and emissions coming from these polluting sources. Right now, my community is on the front line that is being fueled by carbon emissions that is having a serious impact on our climate. As mentioned by the Reverend, we see increased heat in our community. We are, in essence, considered, in my opinion, a concrete jungle, because we don't have the protective climate to keep the greenhouse gases in compliance with the rules that were set by the Clean Air Act. We are home to Marathon, the largest oil refinery in the nation. We're also home to a U.S. Steel, a steel mill. We're also home to another steel mill, Cleveland Cliffs, formerly the Rouge Steel Mill. We're also home to EES Coke Battery, as well as Zug Island. And these industries are overburdening our community and neighborhoods with carbon emissions. We have been in non-attainment for sulfur dioxide for more than 13 years. That means our air has not met the national air quality standard. In my community, we have the highest rate of asthma. In fact, we have been deemed the epicenter for the pediatric asthma burden in Lower Wayne County. In fact, one of the health facilities, which is now Beaumont, formerly Oakwood, called our Detroit public school system to inform them that they were seeing a high rate of children come into their facility with asthma attacks. And that was never heard of. And in my community, we have high rates of cancer that, in my opinion, can be connected directly to carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. I am a cancer survivor. My mother and my father both died of lung cancer. My sister had cancer. 2 of my aunts had cancer. And on my city block alone, more than 12 of my neighbors have died of various cancers. We see diabetes, heart disease, COPD, brain cancer, nasal cancer, any cancer you can name, we have in our community. And our community mirrors many communities across the nation. So we're just one. And that is to say that pollution has no boundaries. What impacts me impacts you. What impacts you impacts me. In the latter years, we learned about another pollutant that has been here for decades, PFAS and PFOs. In my community area of Southwest Detroit, Delray has now been named an area of concern because we have high levels of concentrated PFAS in the soil. So not only are we being polluted by air emissions, we're also being polluted by soil emissions. Not to mention that there's an article called "It's Raining PFAS" that was recently published about 2 months ago. That means the PFAS is in the air. What goes up must come down. So when it rains, it comes down. That means it's going into our water system. So we have to be mindful what this ruling does and who does it impact. It impacts the poor, the Black, the people of color, the people that do not have the economic opportunity to lift themselves up. And we are just one community that will suffer serious complications and impacts compounded from the rulings of this government. I feel that the Supreme Court has become politicized and overstepped their bounds. The EPA is there, the Environmental Protection Agency, who that means, in essence, in my eyesight and understanding, is there to protect human life. Also, this ruling will impact property value. If there's air that is not meeting the quality standard that the government has set, that means our home values go down. Not only that, there's implications of medical. The poor will see more cases of asthma and cancer, and the cost of burden of medical costs will there impact the income of the families. When I grew up, it was common for me to see the sky orange or to see silver speckles and things on our car and black soot on our car, or to wake up and see the sky just black. Unbeknownst to us, the very industries that our families worked at to put food on the table would one day come back to harm us in the ways of chronic diseases and illnesses. So I'm just giving you an insight on how this rule would impact the communities that suffer high emissions of carbon. Right now, we are home to Marathon, as I mentioned. Marathon went from producing sweet oil, that's the oil that is not contaminated with tar sands, to processing tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada. It comes through the Enbridge pipeline right to Marathon's facility where they refine it. That means the chemical composition of their emissions changed. That meant they became more dangerous and more harmful. So I'm not going to belabor you any longer because we can go on different aspects of the connection between diesel fuel emissions, black carbon, and learning disabilities in our children. So I'm going to allow the next speaker to speak. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
I'm really honored to be a part of this panel, and thanks again to all the panelists and Sai for the invitation. As a member of the profession of chemistry, I'm proud of the fact that we have kind of turned around the definition of what it means to be a scientist and a chemist over the last 50 years. We know the role that we've played, placing profit ahead of environmental action over the last, I'd say, ever since basically the end of World War II. And I'm proud to say now that I'm a member of the American Chemical Society that has tried to change people's attitude, not just towards chemistry viewed negatively as a first approximation, hard subject, etc., but also, when it comes to environmental action. And if you want to learn more about what ACS does, our Green Chemistry Institute actually talks about different ways of thinking about how you design chemicals and processes at step 0, so that we don't make things that we know we need to dispose of. And my panelists, friends here have done a much better job understanding what the end product of all of these things is, but I digress. I think the role that I play here as a co-chair with Neutrina Tate from our College of Health Profession for the 7-year journey, Laudato Si here at Detroit Mercy, is to say more about what action we can take immediately. And I think that I've learned a lot. I was charged with by my parish, National Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak a number of years ago to take a look at Laudato Si and give the scientist perspective. And I always go to the same place every time someone asks me to talk about it. It's the only line that I have highlighted in the entire encyclical. I mean, this is the Holy Father addressing the entire planet, 2015, with the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. And that was life-changing for me to read that. Someone as important as Pope Francis, as important as someone in the station of being the Holy Father, to say something like that. I delved deep. I talked to my parish. What are we doing? Well, people want to have legal discussions. They want to have community action discussions. I think Detroit Mercy is uniquely situated, which is why I agreed to help co-chair this committee, with its dual charism from both the Apostolic Preferences, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and the Critical Concerns, which we've heard from the Sisters of Mercy, to sort of bring these two things together and really talk about doing something that would get beyond a lot of the legal things we heard from our lawyer friend, Professor Shroeck, and move into a world of action. I'm sitting here right now with a glass of water and a tumbler of water here. I just, the unbelievable blessing and luck that comes with having clean water like right in front of me is something that can't be underestimated. And I think the way that all these things come together, and forgive me because it's kind of boring, almost put you to sleep kind of logistics, but I've grown up in a world where institutions work on strategic plans. So we know that missions are what you strive to be. Missions are what you hope to get done. Vision statements tell you about what's coming. But I've really gotten my mind turned on by my work with the American Chemical Society into a world of what's called the actual ground-based concepts that define your institution. What are the things that everything flows from? And I joke about this all the time, even with my students. The Pope makes it very clear in his encyclical, the act of making a purchase, we actually already heard that, is an environmental act. When was the last time you thought about that? If this university has money and it buys a box of paper clips, who is making the decision about what further action happens as a result of that purchase? If it's not part of your core values, that it affects every decision that's made in that institution, then it's not really anything other than a book that just ends up on your shelf. It's part of our faith, and we have to follow through on it. This is not like, we'll put that on the side and worry about some other stuff later kind of thing. And I'm actually anxious working with our Office of Mission Integration over the next 6 or 7 years through the 7-year journey to help get the community to start thinking about every single thing that we do from that lens, making it baked into everything that we do. A very wise lawyer friend of mine, who is not here, said that they wish with the Supreme Court decision we're discussing here today, that things were different. You put an ice cube, I could do that right now, on the table and let it melt and then evaporate over several hours. You know, that's different than hitting it with a hammer and shattering it into a million pieces. There's a time difference there. We call it in chemistry a difference in kinetics, how long it takes the change or the reaction to take place. It feels like there's a lot of hammers coming down on things and not a lot of deep thought about how these decisions are going to be viewed. And I'm kind of honored, even though I know it's going to be very difficult, to be a part of the process at Detroit Mercy that's going to get hopefully the university and the rest of the community close by to think more about the consequences to the choices that they make.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to give everybody on the panel a chance to ask each other questions if you want, or comment on things each other has said. And then I'm going to open it up for everybody else to, for their input and their questions. Good.
I just had related to what Theresa was mentioning, and this, I'd love to hear her thoughts on this too. One of the goals of the Clean Power Plan was not just to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but it was also to hasten the retirement of older polluting facilities. And so some of that's actually happened just through market forces, through the cost of natural gas versus cost of coal, cost of wind and solar energy coming down. But I think what's been lost in this discussion, and Theresa was mentioning, I think something related to this, is that by transitioning to cleaner sources of energy or by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, you also then have the co-benefit of reducing a lot of these other emissions like Theresa was talking about, like sulfur dioxide, particulate emissions, and all of that. And so when the Clean Power Plan was initially proposed, the cost savings on healthcare was in the billions of dollars with a B versus the expense of transitioning away from those heavier polluting industries. And so I'm just kind of curious, like on the ground, is that something that has resonated with people, that it's not just the greenhouse gas emissions, which are super important, but it's all that other stuff, right? Like we transition away from these dirtier fuels, we have all these other benefits for health and property values and all, quality of life issues like you mentioned.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, Nick. Right now, the EPA has proposed a federal implementation plan where they're looking at our area. And actually, this is part of the Sierra Club is part of it. And this goes on for miles. This is the area of Delray, where Zug Island is located, the area of Ecorse, where US Steel is located, the area of River Rouge, where DTE now scuttled, they shut it down in, I think, 2020. And what has happened with the bad odors, the air has become cleaner, right? But the government, well, not the government, the state government didn't act fast enough to bring the area into attainment for SO2. So now they have created this plan to control greenhouse gas emissions in our community because they see the impact it has had on our health. We have a high mortality rate among children. Our children are being born with asthma. So if the Supreme Court's decision has any ramifications, it could stop our state government from creating this FIP that will continue to monitor and request and demand and mandate that industry lower their emissions. Right now, US Steel is idle. And just the other day, I rode down the street, they have a whole hiring advertisement. They're hiring for every department and they're paying $29 plus an hour, plus 401k, plus health benefits, right? If that plant comes back online, that means emissions are going to go back up and that this FIP is going to be worth the paper it's on. Because in this FIP, there is no detailed outline or plan how they're going to keep the carbon emissions down. And then another thing, even though they shut down the DTE coal burning power plant, what is the plan if another company comes in and open up? Not only that, if that plant stays shut down, who's going to mitigate the area that is now widespread pollution? And what people don't understand, that our government allows these industries to dispel wastewater into our waterways. And our drinking source is the Detroit River, which leads to the Lake St. Clair, which is our fresh water system that services more than 86 million people in Canada and the United States. So these carbon emissions and these ramifications are widespread, as Matt said. When they hit it with a hammer, it's going to hit everything. It's going to spread. So the impact, we see our home values drop every time the air quality is poor. People don't want to live in an area with poor air. And when a company expands, like Marathon expanded, we saw our home values drop 56%. In our area, the average home price in 1 year, particularly around 2015, it was averaging only between $3,000 to $5,000. Even though we had brick homes, beautiful manicured lawns, the value of our homes drop every time there's poor air quality. And then, as Nick mentioned, the healthcare. Many people, when Obamacare came in, it was a plus because many of our families did not have healthcare. And so their children were being seen on the basis of not the ability, with the ability unable to pay, they were being seen as below poverty level. So the hospital was giving them gratis treatment for free.
Thank you, Theresa. Anything else? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Charles Morris. I'm a faculty, I'm a faculty at Madonna University. Question, Nick, on the abortion thing, Justice Thomas talked about the effect, genocide, effect of death, the mortality that is that. Yet that was kind of bogus, at least that argument, that here it's not. Did that come into any of the conversation? Why is, there, what's not goose for the good, goose for the gander, what's going on?
So, right. And when I talked about the concern of West Virginia v. EPA, like what that ruling could look like, looking at just a few weeks earlier, when we had the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, if you had just, overturned the Clean Air Act, or there's this case called Chevron, and if you ever heard of Chevron Deference, sometimes this gets quoted in the media. This is a case that said that agencies have the ability to fill gaps in congressional legislation. So in their expertise at EPA, they have the ability under the Chevron case to basically interpret what Congress was saying and to pass regulations. The court didn't really go there. And when you talk about the differences between majority opinion and Dobbs, majority opinion in West Virginia v. EPA, the language in the concurrence in West Virginia v. EPA, which with Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas, that's where I think we're going, right? And they're sort of following along some of the similar arguments that we had in the Dobbs case, meaning that they're using, this is my opinion, using historical arguments when it benefits their perspective ideologically, and ignoring a whole bunch of historical arguments that run counter to that ideology. So I guess it's the best way that I can describe it. Like you're basically you're taking convenient facts and ignoring others. Again, this happens all the time in the law, right? Like you come up with an argument based on the facts that you can to get enough votes.
So they're not factoring in the impact on health, human life, and death, particularly people of color and distressed communities.
Well, that's language. So if you're really just saying, and it's sort of convenient to say, we're just going to look at this little piece of statutory language and not consider all of the health implications, all of the climate implications. Mind you, in the Dobbs case, as well as in West Virginia v. EPA, the majority says, we're only talking about this specific instance, right? We're only talking about abortion, or we're only talking about this 111D of the Clean Air Act. That's not how lawyers operate though, right? We look at the language that judges use in their majority opinion, and then we try and make arguments based on the reasoning in those opinions. And so clearest example I can give of this was the Bush v. Gore case in the 2000 election, where the court was like, we're only talking about this presidential election. This case has no ramification on anything else. That case has been cited, I don't even know how many times, as authority in election decisions and in states' authority elections. So to say that we're only looking at these specific issues before us here today, that doesn't really, pass the smell test for me, because that's really, lawyers are always looking at, okay, well, how can I use the language in this opinion to kind of further my client's interests or my, advocacy going forward. So, they are different distinct areas of the law, but I think you can see kind of some of those threads running through these cases. And again, I think they're setting it up. The facts of the West Virginia v. EPA case were not the right facts if you're going to completely upturn the regulatory environment. Those weren't the facts that they needed. They've got to have a better case to do that. And that's what I fear is coming.
Anyone else? Go ahead.
I think we live in a culture of individualism. And this individualism leads us to say, it doesn't affect me directly. Somebody else's problem, let them deal with it. And as I listen to the politicians now running for Congress, no one is talking about the environment or emissions. You don't hear that in any, so apparently they're dealing with what the people want to hear and what they want. And so I'm thinking they're not interested in this. So part of this is educating the public in general of the various things that we've talked about today. And generally it just isn't out there.
Good.
And this is a question I have that's addressed to the entire panel. What specific concrete programs are in place right now with either the League of Women Voters or the ACLU or whatever organization out there to actually have a get out the vote canvassing effort to boost voter turnout in Detroit? If you look at the statistics for the 2020 election, the drop off in turnout in Detroit compared to the turnout historically in Oakland and Macomb County, it's just astonishing. What is out there for us? And I think there are a lot of people at this university that would love to jump at a social justice service opportunity of participating in GOTV canvassing.
That's a hard question to answer right now because of the misinformation that we often see on TV. And that education gap needs to be closed so people can understand when you turn that light on, you have to understand where that source is. And if that source is using clean or alternative energy to produce the electricity to your house, or is it producing a greenhouse gas that is doing damage to Mother Earth, therefore your climate and your environment. And people can't equate to that because they're taking care of that everyday need of turning on that light switch or hitting that gas pedal to get from point A to point B. So the education is not out there. It's not being put through our TV through these advertisements. As you see, Line 5, they talk about all the good things that Line 5 does, but they never tell you that if that Line 5 breaks in our straits or in our lakes, the damage it will do. So we have to find funds and we have to come together as EJ organizations to say, this is the pro and this is the con. And that the educational gap is not being put together for our voters to make the right choices. Right.
And I would add to that I think sometimes there's a disconnect when they do the public opinion surveys of like what are the main issues that people care about, and it's the pocketbook stuff, the economy, inflation, healthcare, whatever. But all of those are directly impacted by climate and directly impacted by the environment writ large. But that connection isn't often made, and so there are groups. I can get sort of cynical about these things and can get really depressed, working in this space all the time. There's a lot of steady work to do, but it can be a little bit discouraging. But one of the things that really does give me hope is that there are, particularly among younger people, there are really active engagement activities for voters on issues related to climate. The Sunrise Movement's one. I know, right, East Michigan Environmental Action Council has done a lot of work of actually getting kids to go do door knocking to talk specifically about their health and about the climate. So I don't know that we're seeing it kind of at a national level the way that I would like to, as far as political messaging, but there's definitely that groundswell. And talking with my law students, I'm sure, Matt probably hears this from his students at the university as well. They're kind of like, what are you doing? Like, we all understand this is a problem. Like why aren't we actually, and I'm not saying us necessarily as faculty, but like adults, right? The people out, decision makers, like, what are you doing? We know this is a problem. And so I hear a lot of just frustration, particularly from younger citizens about, what's going on here. So I think there is that groundswell, but we don't have time for a 30 or 40 year generational shift here, right? Like, we really need to do it immediately. So that gets back to the education Theresa was talking about. But I do want to say there is definitely at grassroots level, there is that kind of engagement, that kind of canvassing going on around climate, but it's not as big of a movement as it needs to be.
I think another issue is media. Our media today is corporately controlled for the most part. So even outlets that we tend to think of as being more progressive in quotes really aren't. And breaking through that whole media scene, I think, is very critical. Another thing is that there's a great need here in Michigan for election workers. So if you probably heard that a large number of people who have been working the polls for years, decades in some cases, have decided to retire given all the stresses of particularly the 2020 election. So there's going to be a real need for people to work at the polls on election day.
Yeah, I would just hybridize everything that we've already heard in a way that says, in the 20 plus years that I've taught here at the university, there's a great hunger among the students. They're waiting for that education that Theresa is talking about. We can't wait 30 or 40 years. So someone will unlock this at some point, for good or for evil, and they will just latch onto it and go, because they come to us a lot. I'm training physicians and dentists and optometrists and pharmacists and lab workers and stuff like that. And they want to know how everything is connected. And so we do the best that we can. I was raised in a different generation. This world of green chemistry that I talked about, that's a gift that I can give them, but then what do they do with it after? There really is nothing. I'm going back to Professor Shroeck. What's at the national level? That's why I keep coming back to core values, because I think everybody would disagree, even if it's like your local muffin company. Like, what are the core values of this institution? But we have to define where everything else is going to flow from. People say, well, this doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah,
That's the Holy Father. This is an encyclical. This is a letter from the Holy See. You can't, it's not a it's just a granola pope. Oh man, we got to do better than that. This is our faith. And that's a perspective that I have from sitting up here.
It's also our culture.
Well, it's part of that individualistic culture we've talked about. But I think that the time is riper than it's ever been. I try very, very hard, without going into a world of toxic positivity, to say all of these things are happening at once for a reason. What is it going to be? And who's going to harness that? That's really the big question.
And we have to start from the universities too. In the universities, we know that University of Michigan has the School of Environment. University, we're going to have to look at what our children are being taught, how to be good stewards of Mother Earth, because the irreparable harm is irreparable. And we have to look at, we only have one Earth, and then we have to look at this decision, how widespread Matt said it could go. We are in the United States, one of the most powerful countries in the world. This will impact and influence other countries with this decision. So I think the narrow view the Supreme Court took was very detrimental.
Okay, we have a couple questions from the chat, from people online, and let me get the two more from here. So over here.
I belong to Citizens Climate Lobby. We had a meeting last night. The monthly presentation was about environmental voter project. And if you go online to Citizens Climate Lobby, you can hear his presentation, which was excellent. But also they're doing training programs for people. And that's all ages. That organization deals and invites people of every political strand, every level of education or young people get to their meetings. So it's a group that can help with that education component. And it's there right now. And the training is there now. So I just wanted to share that.
Great, thank you. Bill?
More a comment as a graduate of UT Mercy and as a Catholic, I'm just really proud to be here. And I want to thank the panel and the university. So, and then also I think that the university, if there's any way that we outside the university and that so-called community, however broad that is, if we can help expand your microphone or expand your voice, let us know. I'm so glad that UT Mercy brought here a leader from Southwest Detroit, which is, I think, 11 miles away, and for that, Ms. Lundgren to have a voice here. This is the stories you were telling, we're not hearing here in Northwest, nor wherever, Northwest Detroit. So thank you, UT Mercy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. We have the questions, so let me raise these, about 5 of them. First one, what goes up must come down. Does that mean we can regulate greenhouse gas emissions using the Safe Drinking Water Act?
I can take a shot at that. So right. So what the technical term there is air deposition. So when we're releasing air emissions, it falls down either just as the particles being weighed down or in the form of rain. The example I often use here, and I need a chemistry assist, but with methyl mercury, with burning coal and mercury coming down in the form of rain, that's why we have mercury contamination in our lakes. By and large, is from burning coal. And so the question about the Safe Drinking Water Act, that's a law that regulates the water that goes through public utility systems. So anything more than really a dozen homes on a water utility system, they have to be permitted under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And there are specific pollutants that are listed under that law that must be reduced to a certain level before that water is deemed safe to drink. The Safe Drinking Water Act has been very successful in cleaning up pollutants. The question is, you've got to list those pollutants under the Safe Drinking Water Act, or they're not regulated. So if we were to list, some other particle, I don't know what I'm trying to think of a good example here that's not going to get me in trouble. But like if we were to list a particular chemical or PFAS, if we were to list that under the Safe Drinking Water Act, then it would have to be regulated. The thing is, a lot of these air deposited pollutants right now are not listed under that law. So that's the issue. And then the Safe Drinking Water Act has its own issues. We know from the water crisis and Benton Harbor's water crisis, water shutoff crisis in the city of Detroit, that there are still some gaps there, particularly on enforcement penalties for when state agencies, federal agencies drop the ball and don't protect people. So that's what I can do.
Thanks. Next question. Thanks for this event. My question, the U.S. bishops make important statements, including denouncing the Supreme Court decision through USCCB. But the vast majority of Catholics will never hear about their position or that of the sisters and other Catholic organizations. How can we help amplify this moral message and spread the word? That's for anybody.
The first thing that I think of is there's some sort of a joke baked into, oh, Matt's a chemist, let's get him to talk about Laudato Si in our parish. You have to start getting people to think about what's written here. And that's going down the 30 to 40 year route. I would encourage everybody to make this a part of what every parish does. It's just very hard for me to calculate why it isn't already. 2015, by the way, 7 years ago. It's either part of what governs every action you take. It's defined exactly like that. Every purchase you make, every decision you choose, it goes back to size, wonder, and awe at looking at nature.
Another question, has the Archdiocese of Detroit signed on to the Laudato Si action plan? There are components for, schools, parishes, diocese,
I-
healthcare, the whole religious communities, and there's various aspects of it for different Catholic entities. I haven't seen,
No,
I wrote to the Archbishop, shortly after it came out, asking what we were gonna do, but never heard it.
Okay, question for Nick Shroeck and Theresa Landrum. I heard Nick mention carbon capture earlier, which is widely considered to be a false solution, especially by environmental justice communities. Could you talk more about the role you see policies around carbon capture play?
Yeah, and I mean, I agree. You know, the carbon capture has been sold as this like, oh, we'll innovate our way out of this, right? We're going to come up with this technological solution that's going to solve all of our problems. And it has not been demonstrated at scale. I mean, you can do it, but at a very small level. It hasn't been demonstrated at scale, like a utility scale, to be able to do carbon capture. I mentioned that as an opportunity for EPA to say, hey, we could require, you know, carbon capture and then force industry to figure it out. Okay, this is the technology forcing we're supposed to do under the Clean Air Act. So, I mean, I agree with the question that it's not something that's sitting there on the shelf today where we can say, you know, DTE, here's this carbon capture machine, you know, implement it in Southwest Detroit, make it work. We're not there yet, but we can you know, this is how they did the Clean Air Act, right? We said you have so many years to come into compliance. You know, you got 10 years for this regulation, 15 years for that regulation. If you build a new facility, you have to meet the utmost, you know, technology. And so that's what I was getting at there, that it's a forward-thinking thing, and that, yes, we have to avoid we're going to put a large solar shade outside the earth to deflect the sun's rays. I mean, you hear these kinds of things as technological solutions. We know what we need to do, and we just have to get serious about doing it. But I appreciate that question, because that's what I was getting at, is that there are these opportunities, but the agency then has to step out and they've got to force some of that technology development, which they've done before. It's not like today we have it, you know, sitting there on the shelf that we can implement it.
And we can't wait for carbon capture to be the solution. We're under a time crunch. The scientists have predicted again that climate change is happening 30% more rapidly than anticipated. So carbon capture right now is not the solution to end the climate crisis.
And if I may too, I just, with Theresa was mentioning this, it occurred to me that you know, cap and trade, the idea that you cap emissions and then over time you lower that cap,
Yeah.
and then you make you know, pollution credits where companies can either, you know, sell and buy and sell credits on an exchange, or they can invest in technologies to reduce emissions. That is a Republican idea. That is a conservative idea. That was something that President H.W. Bush was a real champion of. And now that is like viewed as this, like, you know, liberal boogeyman kind of thing. But that's the kind of thing that we could do that has been shown with sulfur dioxide. I mean, there's still certainly problems in Southwest Detroit, but the acid rain issue was largely solved through a sulfur dioxide cap and trade program. And again, that was a, you know, politically conservative solution there that we have and we can do today, you know, rather than saying there's some, you know, future thing that will solve all of our problems. You know.
Thank you. Thanks for these excellent presentations. What is UD Mercy's outreach to the local community? I live on the Marybrook campus, regarding the Laudato Si action plan.
So the main thing I would say as part of our task force on the 7-year journey is that we have a lot of people coming together, and we definitely have plans to bring in the community to those discussions. Overdue, but getting started.
Thanks, Matt. How was the building of the new bridge further affecting the air quality of the area? And this is directed to Theresa.
Of course, we know why. Truck traffic. No one really hears about mobile source pollution. We see thousands of trucks come through our neighborhood on an hourly basis. And that black carbon that is produced by burning diesel fuel emission will have a detrimental effect on the air quality of the communities that they pass through and will end up going across that bridge through. Not only that, right now, with the building of the bridge, we are working with the Ecology Center with the Air Quality Sensor Collaborative to talk about monitoring the air around these hotspots. And it's devastating the community of Delray and for the people that still live there because of the activity of them digging up and creating dust and PM10 and PM2.5 is one of the major things that contribute to trigger asthma attacks in our children. And then we have to look at the roads that these trucks travel, and they idle, burning these diesel emissions, which is a byproduct is black carbon. Nobody's talking about black carbon. So we're looking at working in the community with community groups and organizations to put in extra monitors. We're talking about purple air monitors that can be stationary, wearable, or mobile, and to track and create our own data, because the ego does not have the capacity in which money and staffing to do monitoring. We're asking for continuous real-time monitoring. So the system of the purple air monitor is in place, and that you can actually get an air monitor, place it on your house, wear it on your arm, and it can give you real-time data on pollution hotspots or poor air quality hotspots from green to red.
Yeah, I'm going to read a few more questions, but before I do, I want to pass around a page, actually 2 pages, and ask those of you who are here to put your name and your email address so we can send out some follow-up information to you. And start with you. Thank you. Okay. This is an informational statement. Michigan Interfaith Power and Light is doing voter engagement registration in Detroit. There's a email address to reach people. Request for contact on future plans of action. They didn't listen to Al Gore in the 80s. Yes, the challenges of media and disinformation that you've mentioned. Voting for candidates who value the importance of the green movement is key. What systemic change can affect which neighborhoods become home to large pollution spreading factories? It's a travesty that Theresa's neighborhood has been targeted. They're us. This should be a no-brainer for Christians. Any comments about strategies?
I'll just say that the way that we do environmental review for, deciding where projects are located, that system's broken. It's been broken for a long time. Theresa talked very eloquently about how we're connected to these electric grids, and that, if I turn on the light switch in my home, I'm benefiting from power that's generated in a facility that's not necessarily in my community, and I'm not as impacted by that pollution in my community. And so you get that whole not in my backyard mentality with heavily polluting industries. So historically, they've been located in communities that had less political influence, less money, less power to fight back. So there's a reason why, in my neighborhood, I don't live adjacent to the steel mill university in Southwest Detroit. That is a lot of what the environmental justice movement seeks to confront and to change, is that the way that those decisions were made historically was wrong. It shut out people that were most affected and most impacted in the fence line community right there in the neighborhood. And I'll just say that we have a long way to go. The tools that we have, things like civil rights litigation, are imperfect for confronting that issue. And so there is, in addition to discussions about climate change bills, there's been legislation introduced on environmental justice, right? Senator Booker in the Senate introduced an environmental justice bill that would actually talk specifically about the siting of heavily polluting industries and dealing with another very important point Theresa made, the legacy of you shut down a coal plant or you shut down a steel mill, there's a lot of contaminated soil there, contaminated water. And you take a community like River Rouge, what was it? The coal plant was like a quarter of the tax base or something, the property tax, right?
$4 million.
$4 million, right out of the hole in the budget when you shut down that facility. So good for air quality, good for climate that you shut down a coal plant, but then the community's left holding the bag. Yeah, so that's, we've got a long way to go there. And like I said, our laws are not by any way meeting the challenge of citing these facilities in an equitable way.
Right. And one thing that we have to understand is that the EPA sets the rule, and then the states and their regulatory agencies set their rules. And one thing that we know is that the EPA can set a rule. The state cannot go below what that rule says, but they can establish and put into place statutes that are stronger than the EPA. So we have to look at the states. But if we're dividing climate change down a political party, the detriment of a Republican-held state could be very detrimental to the people in that state if they go along with the previous administration's plan to restore to save the coal mining industry or gut the Clean Air Act. So they're not thinking about the mass population of the United States that will be impacted. So we have to get rid of these political ideologies that are being harmful to us and therefore Mother Earth.
Do all courses at the University of Detroit Mercy integrate climate change concerns from their perspective?
Mine do, but you know, as an environmental law person, mine certainly do, and I think you know, one of the things we've been working on across the law school is justice, making sure that we're talking about you know, in result, I should say, you know, the George Floyd murder and really this kind of reckoning with policing and all those types of issues. The law school made a commitment to talk about justice in every one of our classes, you know, sort of writ large. So from my perspective, that's been environmental justice, and that's, you know, Theresa's come in and talked to my class and shared her wisdom, and that's a charge that I take very seriously, is that we need to talk about climate. We also need to talk about climate justice, and we need to talk about environmental justice. So that's just me. I know all of our classes are different, but
Let me add to Nick's. I teach in the business school, and I have for a long time. And I've taught Laudato Si ever since it first came out 7 years ago. And I found the students really understand, love it, most of them, and they're really stimulated to think, and it broadens their perspective. Anyway, so there's some hope out there.
Somebody like Victor Carmona in the biology department is really in charge of we call it sustainability for the engineering school, engineering and science school. And he tries to get science students and engineering students together to look at climate conditions, food conditions, and work together to both do the study and also to come up with solutions. Question from Gail Presby. To mention the Pioneers Conference.
yeah, no, and as you're talking, Si, I actually just occurred to me, I was like, you know, there's a great convening that's happening this October here on campus. Gail Presby and I co-chair the Pioneers Conference, which if you haven't heard of the Pioneers, they're a wonderful organization dedicated to tackling a lot of these very issues. The Great Lakes Pioneers Detroit, which we've sort of taken over from a couple sisters who really, Sister Gloria and Sister Paula, who just, you know, for years championed that conference. So there's a whole webpage actually at Detroit Mercy. If you just Google, you know, Great Lakes Pioneers Conference or Great Lakes Pioneers, any of that, you'll find it coming up this October. We've got really good panel presentations set up dealing with issues around climate, water quality, environmental justice, you name it. And actually, I was going to talk to Theresa. One of the things we're going to do is a tour where we will do, and Theresa and I have done these before. Theresa's done many of these environmental justice tours, because one of the best ways to understand these issues is to breathe in the air, to stand next to the wastewater treatment plant, to smell what it smells like, right? To see the house, to see the kids playing soccer at the community center, right?
Contaminated soil.
Right, exactly. And so that's another thing. We'll be having those tours, which are always great. And we also have others on green stormwater management and that type of thing. But thanks, Gail, for the shout out and reminding you to mention that.
Matter of fact, we did a toxic tour yesterday with some students from the ERA program of Dearborn. And one thing we did not address, and that would hope Matt would help with, is cumulative impact of chemicals. We know one thing: do not mix bleach and ammonia, right? Creates a dangerous gas. Well, we have to look at from the chemical aspect of all these chemicals mixing together, like benzene, toluene with mercury and lead and SO2. And our agencies, they are on the books, but they're not utilizing cumulative impact. Yeah. Good.
Gilbert.
Just to call out for another event that's happening here. The Jesuit who oversees worldwide social justice and environment issues will be on the campus, August 8th and 9th. And in Campus Connections, you'll see some different panels that are going to be happening along those ideas. And he's really interested in finding out what's going on in Detroit because he's heard a lot of innovative stuff that's been occurring. So to get a sense of that, but I think also to be able to tour parts of Detroit, especially Southwest Detroit. I've taken my students there from the School of Architecture, and it's quite an eye opener when you get down to Del Rey, and the students refused to roll down their window in their car because they couldn't breathe anymore. It said, now you get the idea of what you're dealing with. So how do we start doing this? But again, look for Campus Connections, and we can send the information out to all those who are involved in this kind of stuff as well.
Well, you have to take them further than Del Rey.
Any other questions? Okay, closing comment from Pam Zarkowski, our provost. This has been great. Thank you for convening. Thank you to the speakers, and the questions have been wonderful. I want to. For my part, I want to thank each of the panelists. You guys have been marvelous, and I have learned a heck of a lot. I want to also thank Alex Hitchell. Without his work, this would never have happened. And then I want to thank Lonnie Ellis and from Washington, D.C. and from Bill O'Brien from here. I want to thank all of y'all for coming. I started off talking about spirituality, and my sense of spirituality is that spirituality involves experience, understanding, and action dealing with our relationship with God. We've talked a lot about our experiences. We've talked a lot about understanding. We need to make sure we do some action. And so I think the Pioneers Conference is one good way to do it. Connecting with voting is another good way to do it. Doing all kinds of little projects on your own is a good way to do it. Doing what Victor Carmona does to try to get scientists and engineers working together on issues of food. So think of things you can do that will move things forward. Thank you.
Thank you.